Hello students, today we are going to discuss about the fermentation. Fermentation is a metabolic process that converts the sugar into the acids, gases or alcohol. It occurs in yeast and bacteria also and also in oxygen starved muscle cells when they have the oxygen deficient condition. As in the case of lactic acid fermentation, fermentation chemical process by which molecules such as glucose are broken down anaerobically. In specific types of the bacteria, the specific types of the glucose, it is a simple sugar, they will be utilized by the anaerobic manner. What is the exactly definition of that fermentation? So, the fermentation is the chemical transformation of organic substances into the simpler compounds by the action of enzymes, complex organic catalysts, which are produced by microorganisms such as molds, yeast, or bacteria. So, the fermentation is a chemical transformation of organic substance into the simpler compounds by the action of enzymes. The different types of the enzymes are synthesized by the bacteria and they will be acts on the specific complex substance and they will be converted into the simple forms. So, the enzymes act by hydrolysis, a process of breaking down the pre-existing complex organic molecule to the smaller into the smaller form, or the specific types of the they will break down into the specific products. They have the economically higher value. So when the sugar plus yeast, that is a different types of the fermented products. For example, curd, wine, beer. These are the fermented foods. These fermented foods. These are unable to carried out without yeast. So the yeast will be acts on the sugar and sugar will converts into the simple form and they have the economically higher value. So, what is the history of fermentation? Fermentation is a natural process. People applied fermentation to take products such as wine, meat made of the fermented honey and water, cheese and beer long before the biochemical processes was understood. In the 1850 and 1860, Louis Pasteur became the first zymologist, one who expert in the field of fermentation or the scientist to study the fermentation when the demonstrated fermentation was caused by the living cell. So the pasture it is known as a so because of this pasteurization process or they can solve the issue of wine and beer industries, and because of this the pasture is commonly known as a father of modern microbiology. So exactly the fermentation is basically aerobic and anaerobic fermentation as based on the respiration or the presence of oxygen and absence of oxygen. The specific process of fermentation which is carried out in case of the aerobic condition, then it is considered as aerobic fermentation. And if the specific process or same process is carried out in case of the absence of oxygen, this is known as a anaerobic fermentation. So in this case of the aerobic fermentation means that the oxygen is present in beer and acetic acid vinegar such as apple cider vinegar need oxygen in the primary or first stage of fermentation. For these specific types of the fermentation, the initial condition or primitive phase, they have to requirement of O2, so it is considered as a aerobic fermentation. When creating acidic vinegar, for example, exposing the surface of vinegar, it is a detailed process of fermentation. In case of the anaerobic, in the specific process is carried out in case of the totally in anaerobic condition. So basically, the well-known studied or well-studied example that is a lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is a biological process by which glucose and other 6-carbon sugars. Lactic acid fermentation is a biological process by which glucose and other 6-carbon sugars, also disaccharides and 6-carbon sugars, the sucrose and lactose, are converted into the cellular energy and the metabolite lactate. So it is converted into the cellular energy and metabolite lactate. The pyruvate molecules from the glucose metabolism may be fermented into the lactic acid. The lactic acid fermentation is used to convert the lactose into the lactic acid in the yogurt production. It also occurs in the animal muscles when the tissue requires energy at faster rate and the oxygen can be supplied. The next into the specific lactic acid fermentation. When in case of the humans, when the human can done the heavy exercise, at that time the body become a body they have the oxygen deficient condition. Also in this case, the specific types of the sugars are utilized by the fermentative manner, and the end product it is a lactate. So types of fermentation are two types, basically homolactic fermentation and heterolactic fermentation. The initial two types of the fermentation are aerobic fermentation and anaerobic fermentation. These are on the basis of presence and absence of oxygen. But the types of fermentation on the basis of the end product, that is the two types of fermentation, that is homolactic fermentation and heterolactic fermentation. In case of the homolactic fermentation, the fermentation in which only the lactic acid is produced. There is no any side product formed after the reaction. But in heterolytic fermentation, the fermentation in which the lactic acid is produced along with some byproducts like different gases. These types of this is a specific type of fermentation. It is known as a heterolactic fermentation. So the specific types of the fermentation, it is classified on the basis of end product. That is, if the only lactic acid is end product of the specific fermentation, that is known as a homolactic fermentation. And heterolytic fermentation, the specific other byproducts as well as lactate when they produce is known as a heterolactic fermentation. So it is about the brief idea of fermentation.